Ashley Cameron was born into a household that seemed ordinary from the outside but concealed deep instability within. Her family life was marked by tension and frequent conflict. From a young age, she witnessed arguments and emotional volatility between her parents and other family members. These early experiences created a foundation of insecurity and mistrust, shaping her perception of relationships and authority. While friends in her neighborhood experienced relative stability, Ashley's environment was unpredictable, and she quickly learned to navigate the stress and anxiety that came with constant domestic friction. As she grew older, Ashley began to exhibit signs of behavioral unrest. Teachers reported that she was occasionally disruptive in class, showing defiance toward authority figures and resistance to rules. At home, her attempts to seek guidance often met with dismissal or punishment, reinforcing her sense of isolation. She struggled to find a stable support system, relying instead on peer approval and seeking acceptance outside her immediate family. This lack of emotional guidance contributed to the development of a rebellious streak, and she started to gravitate toward social circles that encouraged risk-taking behavior. Adolescence intensified these struggles. Ashley faced the typical challenges of teenage identity formation, but her unstable environment amplified them. She was drawn to relationships that offered attention and a sense of belonging, even when those relationships were potentially harmful. Romantic involvement became a central outlet for her need for validation, and she began to prioritize these connections over parental guidance or academic responsibilities. Her judgment was frequently impaired by the desire to maintain approval from her peers and romantic partners, which gradually led her into risky and impulsive behavior. By mid-adolescence, Ashley's life had become a series of reactions rather than decisions. The combination of family tension, social pressure, and a lack of structured guidance created conditions that made her susceptible to negative influence. Minor acts of defiance escalated into more serious confrontations with authority, both at home and in school. Teachers and family members noted a growing pattern of dishonesty and manipulation, which indicated a shift in her approach to achieving her goals. Her behavior increasingly reflected a willingness to bypass rules and social norms in pursuit of immediate gratification or approval. This early period of Ashley Cameron's life set the stage for the events that would later define her as a teen killer. While no single incident predicted the outcome, the accumulation of unstable relationships, a lack of support, and exposure to conflict created a trajectory that would ultimately pull her into criminal activity. The audience is introduced to a young girl whose ordinary life was overshadowed by stress, rebellion, and the subtle influence of those who would later shape her choices in ways that led to tragedy. By understanding the environment and experiences that contributed to her development, viewers can begin to see the context behind the decisions that would culminate in violence. As Ashley Cameron entered her teenage years, her social world began to revolve around her peers, but most significantly, around a boyfriend whose influence would become increasingly central to her life. Initially, the relationship appeared like a typical teenage romance. They shared common interests, spent time together outside of school, and sought the approval of friends within their circle. However, beneath this surface, patterns of control and manipulation started to emerge. The boyfriend exhibited behavior that was both possessive and persuasive, gradually guiding Ashley toward choices she might not have considered on her own. The connection between them became a mixture of loyalty, fear, and dependency. Ashley, already struggling with family instability and a lack of guidance, found a sense of belonging in this relationship. The boyfriend encouraged secrecy and the bypassing of rules, framing minor transgressions as acts of solidarity and shared adventure. Peer pressure and the desire to maintain the appearance of commitment strengthened Ashley's willingness to follow his lead. This influence was subtle at first, skipping classes, small deceptions, but it escalated over time. As the relationship deepened, the duo began making decisions that were increasingly reckless. Social outings turned into clandestine meetings, and whispered conversations evolved into discussions about actions that crossed legal and moral boundaries. Friends and acquaintances noticed a change in Ashley. She became more secretive, defensive, and willing to rationalize questionable behavior. Her allegiance to her boyfriend overshadowed the concerns of family members and authority figures, and she began to internalize the idea that loyalty required obedience, regardless of the consequences. The psychological impact of this dynamic cannot be understated. Ashley's impressionable mind, shaped by years of instability at home, was particularly vulnerable to manipulation. The boyfriend's dominance and insistence on secrecy created a distorted sense of reality, in which risky behavior seemed normal and even necessary. The partnership forged a loyalty that bordered on coercion. Ashley's identity and choices were increasingly entwined with the desires and expectations of her boyfriend. This bond would eventually provide the framework for criminal action, illustrating how relational influence can override moral judgment and legal awareness. By the end of this chapter, the audience begins to see the slow build-up to tragedy. The relationship, once a source of attention and validation, had become a conduit for destructive impulses. Meetings that seemed innocuous to outsiders were, in fact, rehearsals for the decisions that would lead to murder. The groundwork was laid for Ashley to act not as an isolated teenager but as part of a partnership that normalized manipulation, secrecy, and lawbreaking. This chapter underscores the progression from ordinary adolescent romance to a toxic connection with the power to shape life-altering, irreversible choices. The night of the murder marked the culmination of months of escalating tension, manipulation, and risky behavior. Ashley Cameron and her boyfriend had spent the preceding weeks planning their actions, discussing scenarios in hushed conversations that went unnoticed by peers and adults. The secrecy of these plans added a layer of anticipation and dread, setting the stage for a tragedy that would shock everyone who knew Ashley. The audience is introduced to a teenager who, despite her age, was actively participating in premeditated crime. On that evening, Ashley and her boyfriend positioned themselves carefully, ensuring minimal risk of detection. They moved with intent, aware of the consequences but willing to override fear for the sake of loyalty and their shared plan. The victim, Ashley's mother, was unsuspecting. She carried on with her evening routine, unaware that the daughter she had tried to guide and discipline was now plotting against her. Every step of the mother's movements, from entering rooms to attending to household chores, was observed by Ashley and her partner, highlighting the chilling preparation involved. When the moment arrived, the act was carried out swiftly. Witness reports and subsequent investigative findings confirmed that Ashley directly participated in the physical act of killing. Her involvement was not passive, she assisted and executed key components of the crime. The sequence of events was methodical, showing a disturbing level of composure for someone of her age. The narrative of the night emphasizes not only the mechanics of the act but also the psychological state required to proceed. The calm and planning contrasts starkly with the expected behavior of a teenage girl, reinforcing the gravity of the situation. Throughout the night, Ashley's decisions reflected a blend of fear, loyalty, and determination. She followed instructions and engaged in actions that ultimately resulted in irreversible loss of life. The reconstruction reveals the interplay between her influence by her boyfriend and her own agency. Investigators later noted that while she was under pressure, she maintained awareness of the outcome. Each movement contributed to the unfolding of a deliberate crime, demonstrating how her choices intersected with external influence to produce a lethal result. The aftermath of the night began almost immediately. The crime scene bore evidence of the planning and execution, from the arrangement of objects to the sequence of actions taken during the act. Ashley's demeanor and response following the murder became critical in understanding her mindset. Interviews and police reports revealed moments of detachment and compliance, illustrating the complex psychological state of a teenager participating in homicide. The audience is guided through these details in a structured narrative that emphasizes fact-based chronology, building a vivid picture of how a seemingly ordinary household became the site of a calculated murder. By the end of the chapter, viewers comprehend the full scope of the night's events. The planning, execution, and immediate aftermath provide a comprehensive understanding of how Ashley Cameron, a teenager shaped by family instability and toxic relationships, crossed the line into irrevocable criminal action. This chapter serves as the story's climax, anchoring the audience's awareness of the consequences that follow from choices influenced by manipulation, secrecy, and misguided loyalty. In the hours following the murder, law enforcement moved swiftly to investigate the scene. Police officers collected evidence, interviewed neighbors, and reviewed Ashley Cameron's recent activities. Statements from friends and family highlighted behavioral changes, secretive conversations, and unexplained absences. Within this investigative framework, Ashley quickly became a person of interest. Authorities approached the situation cautiously, understanding that they were dealing with a minor, but also recognizing the seriousness of the crime. Ashley was arrested at her home under supervision, and her behavior during initial questioning reflected a mixture of fear, defiance, and compliance. Investigators noted that she was aware of the gravity of the situation but attempted to minimize her role in some aspects. The interrogation process revealed her relationship with her boyfriend as a central factor, confirming the influence that had been building over months. Law enforcement carefully documented her responses, creating a factual record that would later inform the prosecution and defense strategies. The trial that followed became the focal point for public and media attention. Prosecutors presented Ashley as a deliberate and capable participant in a brutal crime, emphasizing premeditation and her active engagement in the murder. They detailed the planning, her direct involvement, and the consequences of her actions, painting a picture of a teenager who crossed moral and legal boundaries with intent. In contrast, the defense argued that Ashley's age and impressionability made her particularly vulnerable to external influence, highlighting the control exerted by her boyfriend and the instability of her home environment. They sought to contextualize her actions as the product of manipulation rather than inherent malice. The courtroom proceedings were tense and closely followed by the community. Witnesses recounted events leading to the crime, forensic evidence was presented, and the narrative of a teenage girl turning against her mother was dissected in detail. The judge and jury were tasked with balancing Ashley's youth against the severity of the crime. Ultimately, the court delivered a sentence that reflected the dual recognition of her accountability and her age. The decision underscored the seriousness of the act while acknowledging the influence and circumstances surrounding Ashley's behavior. Community reaction was varied. Many were shocked that someone so young could commit such an act, while others debated the role of parental neglect, social influence, and peer pressure in shaping criminal behavior. The case ignited discussions about juvenile justice, the impact of relationships on adolescent decision-making, and the ethical boundaries of sentencing minors for severe crimes. This chapter, through its factual reconstruction of arrest, trial, and sentencing, conveys the legal and societal dimensions of Ashley Cameron's actions, emphasizing how a teenage killer became both a cautionary tale and a subject of complex moral consideration. In the years following her conviction, Ashley Cameron remained a figure of public attention, primarily through discussions of juvenile crime and the influence of peer relationships on adolescent behavior. While her day-to-day life in incarceration was largely private, updates revealed that she continued to serve her sentence under conditions appropriate for a minor tried as an adult. Rehabilitation programs, counseling, and educational initiatives became part of her routine, though the impact of the crime and its societal perception followed her consistently. The case of Ashley Cameron is often referenced in legal discussions and true crime analysis as an example of how impressionable youth can be drawn into criminal activity under external influence. Scholars, social workers, and law enforcement professionals have cited her story to illustrate the importance of early intervention, supportive family environments, and awareness of manipulative relationships. The notoriety of the case has endured precisely because it challenges assumptions about who is capable of committing violent acts and under what circumstances. Public memory of Ashley remains complex. Some view her as a tragic figure whose troubled upbringing and social vulnerabilities contributed to her actions, while others see her as a deliberate participant in a heinous crime, deserving full accountability. The duality of these perspectives underscores broader debates surrounding juvenile justice, rehabilitation, and moral responsibility. By examining her trajectory, from troubled teen to convicted killer, viewers gain insight into the fragile boundary between adolescence and accountability, and how quickly ordinary circumstances can escalate into irreversible consequences. Ultimately, Ashley Cameron's story serves as a cautionary tale. It illustrates how instability, toxic relationships, and lack of guidance can converge to produce outcomes that shock families, communities, and the legal system alike. While time moves forward and media coverage diminishes, the case continues to resonate within educational, legal, and psychological contexts. For audiences, it is a stark reminder that the path from vulnerability to violence can be alarmingly short, and that understanding the factors that lead teenagers toward crime is critical in preventing similar tragedies. Christina Joy Fetters was born into a household that, on the surface, resembled that of many American families, but beneath this appearance lay instability and inconsistency. From an early age, she experienced a lack of structure and routine, which affected her sense of security and understanding of boundaries. Parental attention was limited, and guidance on behavioral expectations was inconsistent, leaving Christina to navigate the challenges of childhood largely on her own. The absence of reliable support systems contributed to her growing sense of isolation and frustration. School provided some structure, but Christina's behavioral tendencies often clashed with expectations. Teachers reported occasional defiance, difficulty following instructions, and a pattern of impulsivity. Social interactions were similarly challenging. Christina struggled to form stable friendships and often acted out in ways that sought attention, whether positive or negative. These behaviors were not violent in the early years but indicated a child grappling with unmet emotional needs and an environment that failed to provide consistent guidance. At home, minor conflicts were frequent, and Christina often found herself caught between parental disagreements or facing punitive responses to small misbehaviors. While her peers had access to mentorship, encouragement, and routine, Christina's experiences were marked by unpredictability. This early environment fostered a reliance on self-reliance and a skewed understanding of consequences. The absence of clear boundaries made it difficult for her to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, setting the stage for increasingly risky choices as she entered adolescence. As Christina approached her teenage years, the patterns established in childhood began to intensify. Small acts of defiance escalated, and her methods of seeking attention became more pronounced. The combination of social struggles, emotional neglect, and impulsive tendencies created a complex psychological landscape. Observers noted a growing capacity for manipulation, lying, and testing limits, traits that were not inherently criminal but indicated an emerging pattern of risky decision-making. By understanding Christina's early life and family environment, the audience gains insight into the formative factors that contributed to her trajectory. The instability, lack of guidance, and inconsistent discipline provided the conditions under which a minor could be influenced into actions far beyond the scope of ordinary adolescence. This chapter establishes the foundation for the audience to comprehend how a teenager, faced with neglect and emotional vulnerability, could ultimately commit an act of extreme violence. It is the first step in a narrative that moves from childhood struggles to the irreversible consequences of poor choices, manipulation, and absence of support systems. As Christina entered adolescence, the challenges of her early childhood became more pronounced. Teachers and school counselors observed patterns of impulsivity, defiance, and occasional aggression that raised concerns about her behavior. Assignments were sometimes left incomplete, rules were tested, and her interactions with peers occasionally involved manipulative or attention-seeking actions. These behaviors, while not directly violent, highlighted a growing difficulty in regulating emotions and understanding the consequences of her actions. Socially, Christina sought validation and recognition from her peers in ways that frequently put her at risk. She engaged in friendships and associations that encouraged rebellion against authority and accepted dishonesty as a way to gain approval. The need for attention often led her to lie or exaggerate experiences, creating an environment where small transgressions went unchecked. This behavior revealed both her vulnerability and her developing understanding of how to influence others, a skill that would later play a role in the crime she committed. Within the school setting, attempts to address her conduct through counseling and disciplinary measures produced limited results. Teachers noted that Christina could be cooperative in structured settings but often reverted to impulsive behaviors when unsupervised or when peer influence was present. Observers recognized warning signs, frequent defiance, disregard for authority, and a pattern of secretive behavior that, in hindsight, hinted at underlying issues beyond typical teenage rebellion. These formative experiences emphasized the gap between her potential and the reality shaped by her environment and social interactions. At home, the instability continued to influence her choices. Inconsistent parental supervision and discipline created a context where risk-taking and deception could occur without immediate consequence. Christina began testing boundaries more aggressively, using manipulation and secrecy as tools to navigate both her home and social environments. Her ability to conceal actions and maintain a facade of normalcy masked the severity of her internal struggles and contributed to a growing sense of detachment from the expectations of adults. By the end of this period, Christina's adolescence was defined by a combination of impulsivity, social influence, and environmental pressure. The audience is shown a teenager whose actions were not inherently violent but who was increasingly exposed to situations and behaviors that escalated her capacity for risk. This chapter sets the foundation for understanding how warning signs, if left unaddressed, can compound and lead to devastating outcomes. The narrative prepares the audience for the next stage, the murder of her great-aunt, illustrating the transition from formative challenges to irreversible criminal action. The events of February 21, 1993, marked a turning point in Christina Joy Feder's life and shocked the community of Cincinnati, Ohio. On that day, Christina entered the home of her 73-year-old great-aunt, Arlene Clem, under circumstances that seemed ordinary at first glance. Family members and neighbors later described Christina as having a relationship with her great-aunt that, while distant at times, appeared benign. Yet behind the closed doors of the Clem residence, the situation would escalate into a violent act that no one expected from a 14-year-old girl. Investigators determined that Christina had planned her actions prior to arriving at the house. Her entry was deliberate, and she carried with her the means to execute the act. Arlene Clem was engaged in her usual evening routines when Christina approached, and the confrontation unfolded quickly. The attack involved a stabbing, executed with precision that suggested both awareness and intent. The victim's response was limited. At 73 years old, she had little ability to defend herself against a younger, physically capable assailant. Forensic evidence later confirmed the sequence of injuries, corroborating witness accounts and the impact of the crime and its societal perception followed her consistently. The crime scene revealed the premeditated nature of the attack. Items in the home were undisturbed, and there was no evidence of robbery or secondary motives. Christina's actions were focused entirely on the physical act itself. Witness statements from neighbors and later confessions indicated that she had contemplated the murder in advance, demonstrating a level of planning that contrasted sharply with her age. The audience is confronted with the disturbing reality that a minor, typically assumed to act impulsively or without full comprehension of consequences, engaged in calculated violence. Law enforcement officials documented every aspect of the incident meticulously. Christina's statements during initial interviews, her behavior at the scene, and her interactions with the responding officers contributed to a full understanding of her involvement. She displayed a combination of detachment and compliance, allowing authorities to piece together her direct participation. The case files, photographs, and autopsy reports provided a chronological account of the assault, detailing the exact method and impact of each action. This chapter represents the climax of Christina Feder's story, illustrating the transition from adolescent challenges to irreversible criminal behavior. By presenting the night of the murder with factual detail, the narrative emphasizes both the gravity of her actions and the factors that preceded them. The audience is guided through the planning, execution, and immediate consequences, highlighting how environmental influences, personal tendencies, and situational decisions converge to produce a shocking act of homicide. This reconstruction prepares viewers for the subsequent legal and societal repercussions explored in the next chapter, contextualizing the crime within the broader discussion of juvenile justice and accountability. Following the discovery of Arlene Clem's body, law enforcement moved quickly to apprehend Christina Joy Fetters. Police investigations, combined with witness statements and forensic evidence, established her as the primary suspect. At just 14 years old, her arrest drew immediate attention due to the extreme nature of the crime and her young age. Officers approached her with caution, understanding the delicate balance between treating her as a minor and acknowledging her direct involvement in premeditated homicide. Christina cooperated with authorities to a degree, providing statements that confirmed aspects of the attack while revealing the influence of her personal circumstances. The trial that followed became a focal point of public scrutiny. Prosecutors emphasized the brutality and deliberate planning of the murder, portraying Christina as a conscious and capable participant who had crossed moral and legal boundaries despite her youth. The defense, in contrast, highlighted her age, impulsivity, and environmental influences, arguing that she had been shaped by years of instability, neglect, and the absence of adequate guidance. Mental health assessments and psychological evaluations were presented to provide context for her decision-making, illustrating the tension between accountability and the developmental immaturity of a 14-year-old. Courtroom proceedings were detailed and intense, with witness testimonies, expert analyses, and forensic evidence constructing a clear picture of the events leading to Arlene Clem's death. Testimonies from teachers, counselors, and family members painted a portrait of a troubled adolescent navigating complex social and familial pressures. Prosecutors aimed to demonstrate the calculated nature of the act, while the defense sought to contextualize it within the framework of adolescent vulnerability. The jury had to weigh the severity of the crime against her youth, a challenge that highlighted the broader societal debate over how justice should be administered to juvenile offenders. Ultimately, the court sentenced Christina to life without parole, making her one of the youngest females in American history to receive such a sentence. The decision underscored the legal system's position that certain crimes, regardless of the perpetrator's age, demanded accountability and reflection of societal condemnation. Media coverage amplified the public discourse, with opinions divided between viewing her as a dangerous criminal and a young person tragically failed by her environment. The case became a reference point in discussions about juvenile justice, the ethics of life sentences for minors, and the challenges of balancing punishment with rehabilitation potential. Life in prison introduced a new chapter of isolation and routine for Christina. She was housed under conditions designed for minors tried as adults, which included limited interaction with the general population, structured daily schedules, and mandatory participation in educational and counseling programs. Reports indicated that Christina's behavior in prison reflected adaptation to the environment, though the impact of incarceration on a teenager's psychological development was significant. The audience is provided a lens into the long-term consequences of treating juveniles as adults within the legal system, including emotional, social, and moral dimensions. This chapter illustrates the legal, societal, and personal ramifications of Christina Feder's actions. By presenting her arrest, trial, and subsequent life on death row with factual precision, the narrative examines the intersection of youth, crime, and justice. The audience gains insight into the challenges of adjudicating juvenile homicide cases, the influence of environment and age on criminal behavior, and the enduring questions surrounding rehabilitation and moral accountability. Christina's story, both shocking and instructive, continues to resonate as a case study in the complexities of juvenile justice in America. After serving nearly 2 decades in prison, Christina Joy Fetters faced the realities of long-term incarceration as a juvenile offender tried as an adult. During her time behind bars, she participated in educational and counseling programs, attempting to navigate life within a highly structured and isolated environment. Despite the passage of years, the stigma of her crime and the challenges of incarceration for someone so young continued to shape her experiences. She remained a subject of study and discussion within juvenile justice circles, serving as a stark example of the consequences faced by minors sentenced to life without parole. In 2013, Christina was diagnosed with a terminal illness, prompting a re-evaluation of her situation. Authorities granted her compassionate release, recognizing both the medical circumstances and the ethical considerations surrounding her continued confinement. The release brought her brief freedom after years of incarceration, offering a final period outside prison walls before her death in 2014 at the age of 34. Her passing reignited public interest in the case, prompting reflection on the life of a woman whose adolescence had been defined by tragedy, poor judgment, and systemic failure. Christina Feder's story has continued to resonate in discussions about juvenile justice, ethics, and legal policy. Legal experts, psychologists, and social commentators cite her case when debating life sentences for minors, the capacity for rehabilitation, and the moral implications of treating children as adult offenders. Her experience demonstrates the intersection of age, environment, and decision-making, highlighting how a lack of guidance, social pressures, and immature judgment can culminate in irreversible acts of violence. It also raises questions about society's responsibility in preventing such outcomes and providing appropriate intervention before adolescence escalates into tragedy. Public memory of Christina is complex and often divided. Some view her primarily as a perpetrator of a shocking crime, emphasizing personal responsibility and the severity of her actions. Others consider her a product of circumstance, a teenager failed by family, community, and societal systems, whose early life and social environment contributed significantly to the choices she made. This duality underscores ongoing debates about juvenile criminal responsibility, the potential for rehabilitation, and the balance between punishment and compassion in cases involving young offenders. Ultimately, Christina Joy Fetter's life serves as both a cautionary tale and a point of study for legal and social systems. It illustrates the fragility of adolescence when compounded by environmental stressors, neglect, and lack of guidance, as well as the societal and legal challenges of addressing crimes committed by minors. Her story reminds viewers that early intervention, structured support, and awareness of warning signs are essential in preventing similar tragedies. By reflecting on her life and the consequences of her actions, audiences gain insight into the complexities of juvenile crime, the limitations of the legal system, and the enduring human questions about accountability, mercy, and justice. This final chapter ties together the narrative arc, demonstrating the tragic trajectory from childhood struggles to irreversible criminal action, extended incarceration, and premature death. It emphasizes both the personal and societal lessons drawn from Christina Fetter's case, leaving the audience with a sober understanding of how youth, environment, and critical choices intersect in ways that can shape lives forever. Michelle Lynn Kehoe was born into a household that, despite outward appearances, was fraught with dysfunction and emotional turbulence. From a young age, she experienced inconsistent parenting, where rules and boundaries shifted depending on circumstances. This lack of stability contributed to a sense of unpredictability in her environment, leaving Michelle to navigate daily life with limited guidance and support. Emotional neglect was a recurring theme, as her parents were often preoccupied with their own challenges, leaving her to seek attention and validation elsewhere. In school, Michelle displayed behaviors that reflected both her curiosity and her growing frustration with authority. Teachers noticed early signs of impulsivity, defiance, and difficulty adhering to rules. While she possessed intelligence and social awareness, she frequently tested limits, challenging both authority figures and peers. Social interactions were similarly inconsistent. She could be charming and engaging at times, yet manipulative or confrontational in other moments. These early behavioral challenges were indicative of a child learning to adapt in a household that offered minimal emotional support. Family dynamics further complicated Michelle's formative years. Conflicts at home were frequent, often leaving her feeling isolated or misunderstood. The inconsistency in discipline meant that minor infractions were alternately ignored or harshly punished, creating confusion about acceptable behavior. This environment contributed to the development of coping mechanisms that, while adaptive in a dysfunctional setting, would later manifest in dangerous and manipulative behaviors. Michelle's early exposure to instability and conflict shaped her understanding of power, control, and interpersonal relationships in ways that would influence her future actions. Peers and social settings outside the home offered both refuge and risk. Michelle sought validation and belonging through friendships, but her tendency to challenge rules and push boundaries sometimes placed her in precarious situations. These experiences reinforced patterns of manipulation, impulsivity, and attention-seeking that were becoming central to her behavior. Early incidents, such as minor theft, deceit, or confrontation with authority figures, foreshadowed the more serious actions she would later take, demonstrating a gradual escalation in risk-taking and moral boundary testing. By examining Michelle Lynn Kehoe's early life, the audience gains insight into the environmental and psychological factors that shaped her development. The instability, emotional neglect, and inconsistent discipline provided a context in which adaptive behaviors evolved into patterns that facilitated criminal activity. Understanding her upbringing establishes the foundation for the subsequent chapters, which will explore her adolescence, the warning signs of danger, and the eventual progression into violent criminal behavior. This chapter frames Michelle not merely as a criminal, but as a product of a complex set of circumstances that converged to create conditions for tragedy. As Michelle Lynn Kehoe entered adolescence, the patterns established during her early childhood intensified. Teachers, counselors, and peers consistently observed signs of impulsivity and defiance. In the classroom, she often challenged authority, disregarded rules, and resisted structured activities. While she demonstrated intelligence and social awareness, her behaviors frequently reflected a struggle to control impulses and understand the consequences of her actions. School staff noted that her tendency to manipulate situations and evade accountability was increasing, signaling underlying behavioral and emotional issues. Social dynamics during her teenage years played a significant role in shaping Michelle's path. She actively sought attention and validation through peer approval, frequently aligning herself with friends who reinforced risk-taking behaviors. These relationships often encouraged dishonesty, rebellion, and subtle manipulation. In attempting to gain status or avoid rejection, Michelle engaged in acts that ranged from minor deceit to more aggressive boundary testing. This period illustrates a pattern of escalating behavior where impulsivity and social influence intersected, creating conditions that would later facilitate criminal activity. Counselors and mental health professionals became involved as Michelle's behaviors escalated. They reported persistent challenges with authority and a growing pattern of deceit, noting that her actions were increasingly calculated rather than purely reactive. Warning signs became apparent. She displayed an understanding of how to influence others to achieve her desired outcomes, used charm selectively, and exploited situational vulnerabilities. These behaviors, while not yet violent, were indicative of a personality increasingly comfortable with bending rules to achieve personal objectives. At home, familial instability continued to influence her development. Inconsistent discipline and emotional neglect meant that Michelle had little opportunity to develop structured moral reasoning or accountability. Conflicts at home often left her feeling frustrated or resentful, and she responded by asserting control in ways that were manipulative or confrontational. The combination of home instability, peer influence, and personal tendencies created an environment ripe for risk-taking behavior, reinforcing a belief that actions could go unchecked if carefully concealed or justified. By her mid-teens, Michelle's behavior had begun to reflect a troubling convergence of intelligence, manipulative skill, and a willingness to test moral boundaries. Incidents such as theft, deception, or confrontational disputes with authority were not isolated, they formed a cumulative pattern that suggested an emerging capacity for more serious offenses. Teachers and counselors in hindsight recognized these warning signs as indicators of deeper issues, including the potential for escalation into violent or criminal behavior. This chapter establishes the psychological and behavioral groundwork for Michelle Lynn Kehoe's later crimes. By examining her adolescence, the audience understands how environmental stressors, social pressures, and individual tendencies combine to create a young woman capable of extreme actions. The warning signs observed during this period highlight the complex interplay between age, environment, and personal choice, emphasizing that criminal behavior does not emerge in isolation but is often the product of cumulative influences and unaddressed vulnerabilities. Through this lens, viewers see a teenager whose defiance, impulsivity, and manipulative behaviors were precursors to tragic outcomes. The narrative prepares the audience for the next stage in Michelle's story, the transition from adolescent warning signs to deliberate and calculated criminal acts. By connecting early behaviors to later consequences, the chapter underscores the importance of intervention, guidance, and awareness in preventing young individuals from following a path toward violence. Michelle Lynn Kehoe's descent into violent crime marked a turning point that shocked both her community and law enforcement. By adulthood, the patterns of manipulation, impulsivity, and risk-taking that had emerged in her adolescence had escalated into deliberate and premeditated criminal behavior. Unlike impulsive acts of youth, her crimes demonstrated planning, foresight, and a willingness to exploit both social and situational vulnerabilities. Investigators later described a methodical approach to selecting victims, understanding routines, and executing actions with calculated intent. The first known murder committed by Michelle occurred in the context of personal relationships and financial disputes. She targeted individuals with whom she had existing ties, using their trust to gain access. Witnesses and investigators reconstructed her interactions with the victims, noting her ability to charm, manipulate, and deflect suspicion. Each act was preceded by careful observation, indicating a level of premeditation that contrasted sharply with her earlier impulsive behaviors. The audience is presented with a picture of a woman who had learned to use her environment, intelligence, and social skills to carry out lethal actions. Forensic evidence played a key role in piecing together the sequence of Michelle's crimes. Investigators documented the scenes meticulously, collecting fingerprints, weapon traces, and other material evidence that linked her directly to the murders. Autopsy reports detailed the nature of the wounds, the method used, and the timing of each attack, providing factual clarity about the violence inflicted. Witness accounts and prior interactions with the victims helped contextualize the motives, revealing financial gain, revenge, or personal grievances as underlying factors. The combination of planning and execution highlighted a disturbing evolution from adolescent defiance to adult criminality. Michelle's ability to manipulate those around her extended beyond her immediate victims. Friends, acquaintances, and even family members were drawn into her schemes, often unwittingly assisting in covering up activities or providing alibis. This social manipulation reinforced her capacity to evade early detection and allowed her to maintain a facade of normalcy. Law enforcement officers later noted the chilling contrast between her outward appearance and the calculated violence she was capable of committing in private. The cumulative effect of Michelle Lynn Kehoe's actions left a trail of shock, grief, and societal reflection. Each crime underscored her transformation from a troubled adolescent into a deliberate and capable offender. By examining the methods, planning, and execution of her killings, the audience gains insight into how psychological, social, and environmental factors converged to produce behavior that was both calculated and devastating. This chapter serves as the climax of her story, emphasizing the gravity of her actions and the complex interplay between individual choice and systemic influences. Through this reconstruction, viewers are confronted with the reality that Michelle's crimes were neither random nor impulsive. They were the product of years of behavioral escalation, learned manipulation, and calculated planning. The narrative prepares the audience for the subsequent chapter, which will explore her arrest, the trial, and the legal consequences of her actions, illustrating the full arc from troubled youth to convicted murderer. Michelle Lynn Kehoe's arrest marked the beginning of one of the most closely followed female criminal cases in recent American history. Law enforcement officials, acting on forensic evidence, witness statements, and patterns observed across multiple crime scenes, apprehended her with caution. From the outset, investigators recognized the unusual nature of the case. A woman, previously considered capable of manipulation and deception, had escalated to premeditated murder. Her demeanor during arrest was calm yet controlled, reflecting a mixture of compliance and underlying awareness of the gravity of her situation. The legal proceedings that followed captured national attention. Prosecutors emphasized the calculated and deliberate nature of her actions, highlighting evidence of planning, execution, and repeated engagement in lethal conduct. They portrayed Michelle as a dangerous offender who had methodically exploited trust and familiarity to commit her crimes. Expert witnesses provided detailed analysis of her criminal patterns, reinforcing the argument that she possessed the cognitive and emotional capacity to understand her actions and their consequences. The prosecution's narrative focused on the severity of the crimes, arguing that her calculated behavior warranted the maximum penalties under the law. The defense, however, sought to contextualize Michelle's actions within the framework of her personal history and psychological profile. They highlighted her troubled upbringing, patterns of neglect, and formative experiences that had shaped her behavior. Mental health evaluations were introduced, showing tendencies toward manipulation, impulsivity, and antisocial behavior, but also revealing underlying trauma and environmental influences. Attorneys argued that these factors mitigated, though did not excuse, her culpability, providing the jury with a nuanced understanding of how her life experiences contributed to the development of criminal tendencies. Courtroom proceedings were extensive and intense. Witnesses included friends, family members, law enforcement officers, and forensic experts. Each testimony built a detailed picture of Michelle's character, her interactions with victims, and the sequence of her crimes. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints, weapon traces, and crime scene analysis, linked her definitively to the acts of murder. The prosecution and defense engaged in meticulous examination and cross-examination, revealing both the sophistication of her planning and the vulnerabilities in her character and history. The trial highlighted the legal complexities of prosecuting a female serial killer, a category of criminal that remains statistically rare and often evokes strong public reaction. Public interest in the case was intense. Media coverage highlighted the shocking nature of a female offender committing multiple murders, generating debates about gender, morality, and criminal accountability. Opinions were divided. Some viewed her as a uniquely dangerous individual deserving of severe punishment, while others focused on systemic failures, early warning signs, and societal influences that had contributed to her trajectory. The case became a reference point in discussions about female criminality, juvenile influences carried into adulthood, and the broader justice system's approach to serious offenses committed by women. Ultimately, Michelle Lynn Kehoe was convicted of multiple counts of murder and related charges. The court imposed sentences that reflected the seriousness of her crimes, ensuring she would serve significant time in prison. The sentencing underscored the legal system's position that deliberate, repeated acts of lethal violence require accountability, regardless of gender. Michelle's reaction to the verdict was subdued, consistent with her behavior throughout the investigation and trial. The chapter also explores her initial adjustment to prison life, highlighting the transition from freedom to incarceration and the psychological weight of facing long-term consequences for her actions. This chapter illustrates not only the legal journey of Michelle Lynn Kehoe but also the societal, ethical, and psychological considerations surrounding her case. By detailing her arrest, trial, and sentencing, the narrative provides viewers with a comprehensive understanding of the judicial process, the arguments presented by both sides, and the complexities inherent in addressing violent female offenders. It sets the stage for the final chapter, which examines Michelle's life in prison, her enduring legacy, and the broader lessons drawn from her story. Following her conviction and sentencing, Michelle Lynn Kehoe entered the correctional system, facing the reality of long-term incarceration. Her life in prison reflected the challenges of adapting to an environment designed for serious offenders. Michelle was housed in secure facilities with strict routines, limited interaction with the general population, and mandatory participation in rehabilitation and educational programs. Her behavior within the prison system was noted to be controlled and compliant, demonstrating her ability to navigate the highly structured environment while reflecting on the gravity of her actions. Michelle's case continued to capture public attention, becoming a focal point for discussions about female criminality. Statistically, women constitute a smaller proportion of violent offenders, and her actions were viewed as exceptional and alarming. Criminal justice experts examined her case to better understand the psychological, social, and environmental factors contributing to violent behavior in women. Psychologists highlighted the combination of early childhood neglect, adolescent impulsivity, and manipulative tendencies as significant contributors to her criminal trajectory. Her life became a reference point for studies exploring how female offenders can evolve from troubled youths into adults capable of premeditated violence. In prison, Michelle's engagement with rehabilitation programs was limited by both her environment and her prior behavioral patterns. While some progress was observed, it was clear that her formative years had ingrained behavioral tendencies that were challenging to modify. Educational programs, counseling, and controlled social interactions provided opportunities for reflection and learning, but the long-term impact of her early life and choices continued to shape her experiences. For the audience, this illustrates the enduring consequences of early neglect and the difficulty of reversing deeply established patterns of behavior, even under strict supervision. Societal perception of Michelle Lynn Kehoe was complex and divided. Some members of the public focused solely on her role as a murderer, emphasizing personal responsibility, the severity of her crimes, and the necessity of strict legal consequences. Others considered the broader context, a woman influenced by early trauma, neglect, and environmental instability. This duality sparked debate on the intersection of gender, criminality, and accountability. Her case underscored the challenges of addressing female violence in a system historically oriented toward male offenders and highlighted the need for nuanced approaches in both prevention and legal adjudication. The broader implications of Michelle's story extend beyond her personal experience. Her trajectory demonstrates the warning signs that often precede violent behavior: early childhood instability, adolescent manipulation and impulsivity, and the gradual escalation of risk-taking behavior. By examining these factors, professionals and the public can gain insight into preventive strategies, early interventions, and societal responsibilities in identifying at-risk individuals before minor behavioral issues escalate into criminal actions. Michelle's life serves as both a cautionary tale and a case study in understanding the complex interplay between upbringing, personality, and opportunity in the development of violent behavior. Ultimately, Michelle Lynn Kehoe's legacy is defined by the combination of her actions, the legal consequences she faced, and the lessons her case offers to society. It emphasizes the importance of early intervention, structured support, and awareness of behavioral warning signs. Her story is a stark reminder of how environmental, psychological, and social factors converge to shape an individual's choices and underscores the challenges faced by the criminal justice system in balancing accountability with rehabilitation. This chapter concludes the documentary arc, providing viewers with a comprehensive reflection on Michelle Lynn Kehoe's life, crimes, and enduring impact. By connecting her upbringing, behavioral patterns, criminal actions, legal outcomes, and societal implications, the narrative delivers a complete portrait of a woman whose life illustrates the complexities of violent behavior, the challenges of female criminality, and the lasting lessons that can inform prevention, policy, and public understanding.